Hi everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. Today I am super excited. I'm joined by Len Zaichkowsky and Dan Peterson, and they've written a fantastic book recently. They've partnered up and written the Playmakers Advantage, How to Raise Your Mental Game to the Next Level. And just giving you some brief introductions, Len has been a professor, researcher and consultant for almost 4 decades at Boston University, and he's a pioneer in sports psychology by bringing cognitive neuroscience and sports performance together as an interdisciplinary science. He has, well, who hasn't he consulted with? He's consulted with everybody. He's consulted with teams from the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, the MLB, Australian rules football, the Spanish men's national soccer team, wow, and Olympic sport organisations around the world. He's been on too many psychological boards to mention, so I won't do, because we'll be here for the next half an hour talking about them. But I would like to say he's recently the American Psychological Association honoured him with the Distinguished Service to the Profession Award. Today he is the co-founder and senior consultant at 80% Mental Consulting. He advises coaches, teams and sports organisations on developing athlete cognition. And his business partner in that is a gentleman called Dan Peterson, who's also on the line, and he's a writer and consultant specialising at the intersection of neuroscience and sports performance. He combined 25 years of technology management experience with his second life as a sports dad and coach to explore how athletes make decisions, and now he works alongside Len, advising those coaches, teams and sports organisations to understand and improve their cognitive game. Gentlemen, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Well, thank you for having us, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Dan. It's always enjoyed the podcast. It's great to be on it.
Well, I'm so excited about this next hour, and I can tell you, both of you and the audience, that I've been engrossed in your book, The Playmakers Advantage, for the past couple of days. I've pretty much read it in just a few sittings because it's so relevant to what I do on a day-to-day basis in my role as a sports psychologist. And I know it's very relevant for coaches, for players themselves, for parents, for the curious parents, sports parents, for sports scientists. It's so rich in information. So you've titled it Playmakers Advantage, and Playmaker, it's quite an ambiguous title. So I kind of know how I would define a playmaker, but how do both you gentlemen define playmaker?
Well, Dan, I'd be interested to hear how you would define it.
Oh, thanks for putting me under pressure there, Dan. Thanks so much there.
You have to deal with them on a daily basis. In the consulting you do, you've got playmakers all over there.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll try and keep this brief, because you could have asked me a question there where I can go off on one for about the next hour. But the one thing I'd say before I try and define it succinctly is that I don't necessarily perceive it as somebody who is that, if we're talking in soccer terms, for instance, which would be one of my main sports, as that it has to be a Lionel Messi type character, that it's got to be somebody in the middle of the park who has all the tricks and the skills. Perhaps the popular version is that, but I think anybody can be a playmaker in many respects, because I just think it's seeing with foresight and it's acting with speed. It's seeing with foresight and it's acting with speed. That's kind of how I would define it. And there's so many little branches off of that, but that would be for anybody on the football pitch, the court, the course, whatever sport it is. See with foresight, act with speed. I think that's a playmaker. You can be a defender if you do that. You can be a striker if you do that. You can even be a goalkeeper to a degree. I think Neuer, the famous German goalkeeper, is a playmaker in many respects.
Sure.
So, please, you guys are the experts. Dan, Len.
Well, Yeah, well, let me just kind of start. You had some great comments, and you kind of verified with the Boston Celtics coach shared with us, Brad Stevens, because we came in there as NBA fans and knowing who the playmakers were on the Celtics, and they're quite often the point guard. And man, he kind of put that to rest and told us now that here's the real playmaker for the Celtics, and the big man in the middle. And yet he got very little attention with the Boston media and the press and the NBA. So it was getting the coach's perspective, and he talked about it much like you just did, is that, that they had this ability to read things, and most importantly, he always executed kind of flawlessly. And so, yeah, and you're right about everybody having that, and that's what we proposed in the book, has the capacity to develop skills that can make them a playmaker in their own right.
It's like, as Len said, when we wrote this book, we wanted to, and just to give you a brief background, I've been fascinated with this for a long time just as a non-academic. I certainly don't have the credentials that Len has or you have, Dan. And so I came at this from like I said, a sports dad, someone very interested in sport. I enjoy the writing part. But what always fascinated me, and I went into that in a little bit in the introduction, is just watching these players, soccer players, hockey players, etc. And my wife and I raised 3 boys, and watching them out on the field, even when they're young, and some of the kids just seem to get it. They just seem to see the field, see the ice a little bit faster, a little bit better. They see passes that others don't. They're just a step ahead cognitively, and that's a combination that we'll talk about. But that's what I was always curious about, is what is that? What is that sixth sense that they have that others don't? And then obviously as they progress through training and through the years, others can develop that. And so Len and I shared a common vision that, there's a lot going on cognitively, certainly in traditional sports psychology and all of the important concepts that are taught about motivation and attitude and confidence. But we really focused in this book on the pure cognitive science of it, the visual perception, the decision-making, the working memory, all of those things that help them make all of those important decisions out on during the game. And so we wanted to choose a term that would resonate with parents and coaches, but also with professionals like yourself. And playmaker just kind of jumped to the top of mind as far as a term that people understand when they hear it. You hear it a lot in the press, and you hear a lot of pundits talking about he's a playmaker. But we tried to break that down to describe it a little better as far as what are those qualities and how can we identify them and how can we train them. So that's really where that came from.
Yeah, and it's a little bit different, Dan, from what you see in the psychology literature, experts. And people will often shake their head when you mention the word expert. Like, what is that? And in sport, oftentimes we use the most valuable player, the exceptional athlete, the champion athlete. So we put a little different spin on it, and we're hoping to get some traction too, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
And I think that I like it, the term playmaker, and I think that what's so important here is narrative. I'm passionate about the narrative around sport, sports teams, young people developing within sport, and I think sometimes we can pigeonhole young players into an identity. As coaches, we can be guilty of saying, well, he's big, he's strong, he's tough, but he's got a bit of a leaden foot, he's not going to be the playmaker here. But I'm passionate about creating a narrative. What I love about your book, to me, is it brings to life this notion that everybody in every position can have an element of playmaker about them. You might not have a centre-back on the soccer pitch who is traditionally seen as a playmaker, but he or she might want to develop the kind of skills which we'll go on to talk about, that can help them execute in the style of the playmaker at certain times. So I picked one quote out here, and this is from the legendary Italian defender Paolo Maldini. I love this quote. He says, "If I have to make a tackle, then I've already made a mistake." The passage there it has connotations of, well, look, if I've got if the skill here is tackling, that's fine. I can be a great tackler, but the reality is it's about the awareness, the searching, the making the decision to fill space before the striker gets into that space or has the ball in that space. It's actually the soft skills that are more important than the hard skills here. Paolo Maldini would not, just as any other Italian defender in soccer, wouldn't be regarded as a playmaker, but actually so much of his capability and so much of his success is down to the kind of cognitive perceptual skills that you're talking about in the book that people wouldn't even begin to think about. Now, just one thing to say here, that's so important for the narrative within every sport for coaches, because it's so important for coaches to get across, we can help players in this area, the cognitive perceptual area. We can help every player, no matter who they are. We can extend the narrative here to every player has the capacity to have a bit of playmaker about them.
For sure. Yeah, that was a great example. I'm glad you brought that one up. That's you hit that one right on. Yeah. And I like to use the word, the notion of these playmakers being quick on their feet. You know, we have that great English expression, being quick on your feet. When in reality, it's really not quick on your real feet, but quick in the mind. And I like that, being quick on your feet.
And Dan, the interesting thing about, like you said, that Maldini quote, the amazing thing that we found through some research with him, and when he was talking about that, the fact that per game he only needed a half a tackle per game in his 25-year career, whereas others, defenders, would average 4 to 5 tackles per game. And so that's what he was getting at, is my positioning, my movement, my decision-making prevents me or allows me to not have to dive in and make tackles and get fouls, etc. I'm already thinking ahead of people to be where I'm supposed to be. And following that up with, Xabi Alonso said the same thing. His quote in that same page, I don't think tackling is a quality. It is something you have to resort to, not a characteristic of your game. I can't get into my head that football development would educate tackling as a quality, something to learn, to teach, a characteristic of your play. How can that be a way of seeing the game? And obviously Alonso is one of the great playmakers through the years.
And to back up that notion, I just a very, very brief story here. Fabio Capello, the Italian manager who managed England for a number of years, who ultimately it didn't quite work out with the England team for him. But I had a very interesting story as one of his first training sessions, where, because in England, possibly like the States in soccer, historically, the last-ditch tackle, the last-ditch header has been the thing that has got the crowd on their feet and roaring and clapping and applauding. And it happened in a training session whereby there was a last-ditch tackle, and Capello stopped the play, and I think fellow teammates sort of congratulated this player for this wonderful last-ditch tackle. But actually, Capello came over and in sort of broken English said, no, you were in the wrong position in the first place. You shouldn't have needed to have made that tackle. So it's so true. Just, if I may, if we can strip this back and begin at the beginning, what I love about your book, because when I opened it up, I expected to be confronted with the first chapter that launches straight into search, decide and execute and cognitive science, but actually you guys start at the beginning of the life form or the life cycle of participation in sport, and actually start from a participative angle, and you talk about it almost feels like you're laying the groundwork for a young player to develop these skills eventually, and that starts with the disadvantages of early specialisation in sport and the essentials of movement characteristics. Can you talk to us a bit about, you wrote about the disadvantages of early specialisation. Talk to us a bit about that and perhaps its link to being a playmaker.
Well, let me take a shot at that first, Dan. Yeah, that's. I think the research is pretty clear on that now. That what we should be encouraging, and all as parents and coaches that have children in their youth sample a variety of different sports, because we have no idea what they really have a skill set for and a passion for in playing, and we might, as parents, particularly socialize them into a sport that we had some really good success in, or we, for whatever reason, really like that sport. So we socialize our kids into it, and in fact, they could be much better off in another sport and still stay physically active through a lifetime of training and appreciation for sport. So, yeah, the research is pretty clear on that, but yet when you talk to parents, they don't want them to fall behind and for a particular sport, and will encourage them to play 12 months a year-round in that particular sport, because they're fearful of falling behind. And yet when Dan and I spoke to all these wonderful coaches and athletes, they all really encourage that they participate in a variety of different sports, sample them, and when you get into your early teens, then start to specialize in a sport that you've really got a passion for and a good skill set for. So, Dan, you may want to expand on that a little bit, but that's my first take on it.
Yeah, it's Len and I were both parents. We raised boys in sports, and so we've seen it from the parent side as well. And there's always that. We could probably write a book about parents, but there's always that passion from the parents, and of course, it's somewhat human nature that you want your child to excel. You want your child to be on the best team with the best coach, winning the trophies, etc. And that's part of what we kind of wanted to open the book with. We didn't want it to be another, youth sports is broken and everything's, the sky is falling. Yeah, there's problems, but there's millions and millions of kids who play sports and have fun. But we did want to point out a few things about that. And part of the reason of trying to get into the science later on is to just open with, first of all, the numbers aren't looking great. Kids are burning out. They're usually dropping out of sports by age 12, 13, 14. And rather than just, wring our hands about it and say, that's terrible, well, let's get into it a little more and let's talk about, why they don't enjoy it anymore, et cetera. And so we tried to, when we talked to a bunch of the folks we interviewed, folks like Len said, Brad Stevens and Sidney Crosby, the center for the Pittsburgh Penguins, they all kind of said the same thing, that, first of all, they're not in favor of young kids doing sports specialization. Yet we know that the machine, if you will, the youth sports machine, favors that, and coaches want to get them younger and younger. And Dan, maybe you can talk about the Bournemouth Academy, et cetera. But so while the coaches at the highest level say, yes, play multiple sports, do all those things, the reality is, we still have to work with parents and coaches to help them understand that you could probably actually raise a better athlete if you let them play multiple sports. Some of the research we found was that there is some transfer of cognitive skills between related sports. So if you were to let a 12, 13-year-old play soccer in the fall and hockey or basketball in the winter and baseball in the spring, as long as the sports are somewhat related strategically, to learn how to move an object down the field, pass, shoot, etc., they can still build those cognitive skills, yet it's a different sport, it's a different group of kids, it's a different coach. They don't have the physical and mental burnout from playing one sport for 12 months. So, we just tried to open, and then some of the comments in Chapter 2 and beyond about, okay, when we talk about being an expert, being a playmaker, etc., how do we measure that? How do we understand when someone is getting better cognitively? How can we measure decision-making? There's so much emphasis now in the combines, if you will, for youth of physical measurement. How fast are they? How quick are they? But what are some ideas of how we could measure them cognitively so we know, hey, we've got a playmaker on our hands here. So we just tried to open it with some of that before we got into the thick stuff.
Yeah, Dan, you probably also noticed in reading the first part on the foundational things that you just mentioned, and one of the things that we try to emphasize came from my former student, Dr. Avi Feigenbaum, whose dissertation in the 90s at Boston University really became the gold standard for strength training in kids. And he's continued to work in that area. And we tried to really, in his interview, was fabulous, how he emphasized what he sees across, at least here in North America, kids with insufficient strength, yet their parents want them to be involved in competitive sport. And he said many of them are just not ready. They haven't developed that foundational strength, in part because of today's society where it just doesn't encourage that kind of strength development. So we try to introduce that as well, that look, parents and coaches, make sure the kids are sufficiently developed with strength and conditioning to play these very competitive sports. Otherwise, they're going to get injured, and man, I don't like this sport anymore, and I'm out of here.
What I love about that first chapter is it provides evidence, it provides an education process for parents to start to understand the initial journeys towards sporting excellence. My view is that, as you alluded to there, Dan, the reality is lots of great stuff happens, and parents make decisions 99.9% of the time out of love and care and
sure.
and want for their kids to do well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to do that. And what you're providing with that chapter, along with other resources that are out there, is an education in how that can start. And the three things I wrote down as you're talking there, but also when I think about that chapter, is fear of practice deficit. There's such a fear of practice that I have had. My child has to have had, or an athlete has to have had, these enormous amount of hours in the bag by about 12 years old. Otherwise, they won't make it, in inverted commas. The other one is overestimating the importance of high performance and winning at a young age. As you guys alluded, there just isn't the correlation there between eventual success in the sport, whether that's a college scholarship or eventually professional status. And then the final one is underestimating that the transfer of movement efficiency from sport to sport, and also the cognitive efficiency or similarities from sport to sport that you talked about, Dan. So I think it's a fantastic chapter, guys. I really do.
Well, thank you.
And, I was going to mention, Dan, one of the things, one of the great things of working with Len and his experience is he knows everybody. And so one of the fun things was when we initially started talking about the book, and I brought Len showed him a video I found on YouTube, and it was Mike Sullivan, longtime NHL coach, currently the coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's won a couple Stanley Cups. And this was a few years ago, and he was giving a presentation to 300 hockey coaches, etc., talking all about cognitive science, about how the brain works, he was so excited about it and saying, guys, we really have to focus on this stuff. And so much so, and I mentioned it to Len, and he goes, well, sure, Mike Sully was one of my students at Boston U when he played hockey there, and he called him up, and we chatted, and we were very fortunate Mike wrote the foreword for the book. But I wanted to call out one of the quotes that's in his foreword for the book that really kind of, even at his level, at the top levels of hockey, this quote says, and this is Mike Sullivan, when I was playing in college in the late 80s, the new frontier was in physical fitness and training. That's when players started to get into the weight room to work on strength and conditioning. That was cutting edge back then. Now we have a pretty good understanding of how to train athletes physiologically. The next frontier is how to get players to better understand anticipation skills, recognition skills, and decision-making. He said, in my generation, there's always been an assumption around the rinks that hockey sense, in quotes, is something that you're born with. You either have it or you don't, but you can't teach it. The reality is that hockey sense or game sense is not unlike learning how to skate or learning how to stick handle. And that's what he was excited about with the book as well, as he said, yes, we have to start a conversation about this stuff and have people start to talk about it as much as we've talked about over the last 10, 15 years about physical training.
So, hockey sense, game sense across sports, you use the
Sure.
term athlete cognition, and you break that down to search, decide, execute. Can you talk to us a little bit about athlete cognition and search, decide, execute?
You want to start, Dan?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So again, with the goal of starting this conversation and kind of building a vocabulary for parents and coaches and athletes to talk about the cognitive side of the game, Len and I, there's no magic here. We just thought, again, just like we used the term playmaker, we wanted to introduce a term that kind of tried to describe, let's take soccer, for example, football, the hundreds of times a game that a player on the field is going through this loop of assessing what's out there on the field, searching for opportunities, making a decision in their head, typically in a split second. What is my best option that's been given me here? Should I pass? Should I shoot? Should I dribble? What should I do here? And then obviously executing, being able to have the motor skills to be able to pull off the decision that was made in their brain. And so we thought we'd put that together into something called the athlete cognition loop, to be able to break those big topics down and talk about each of them. They're all interrelated. They all depend on each other. But when we looked into treasure trove of research that's out there on all these different aspects, they kind of fell into one of those three categories: visual perception, the searching for opportunities, using vision, using hearing, etc. Actually making decision. There's a whole database of research of how athletes make those decisions, and then being obviously training the physical skills to be able to pull that off. So that's where that started, and it built on research that's done outside of sports. One of the very fascinating books that have come out over the last 10 years is from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, and his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it talks about all his research over the years with his research partner, Amos Tversky, and just fascinating stuff about how we make decisions in either a system 1 or system 2 thinking, fast or slow thinking. System 1 being those things you not automatically know. 2 plus 2 is 4. You don't have to think about it. You see an object flying at your head, you duck. You don't think about it, you just duck. Versus a system 2 or slow thinking where you actually have to think about something. 17 times 45. Well, I can do that in my head, but I'm going to have to stop and think about it for a minute. Or if I'm on the field, complex situation, what is my best option here? I may have to think about it. So it really goes from, the idea is to move from system 2 to system 1 so that when an athlete's on the field, so many more things are automatic. When you're a young football player, you're looking at your feet all the time when you're learning how to dribble. As you advance, dribbling a ball at your foot is something you do without thinking about it. It's subconscious. And you can focus more on higher level things like what decision to make up here. It's the same with a lot of different sports, dribbling a basketball, etc. So that's what we tried to bring into this conversation about. There's research outside of sports that talks about how humans advance in their decision making. Len, what else do you have?
Well, no, just to emphasize kind of the rapidity of this happens. The brain processes information in milliseconds. As an athlete, we're generally, having to make a decision in about a second, and yet the brain is just the wheels are turning rapidly. And as Dan was saying, we want to automate these skills. And how do you automate them? Well, it's constant, this functional, deliberate, Anders Ericsson called deliberate practice, or others are calling more intentional practice. That's how you get there, so that this all becomes automated, and they can make the great, accurate decisions at any given moment in a soccer match.
I've spent a proportion of time, a large proportion of my life, next to the soccer pitch. I've been very fortunate enough to do so at a very high level, and probably like yourself, Len, and you've done that across a range of sports. And when I watch, I'm trying to put myself in the boots or into the brain of the player. And when we strip back search, decide, execute, when we start with search, I think so much of a player's potential starts with what they are looking at. Literally what they're looking at. If we really let's just, I love to strip things back and go, okay, well, how does this work here? Let's not just see this as a minefield of complication. I know it is, but what are they looking at? And where I think it's a really interesting landscape is that what a player looks at within their given sport is often determined by not just are they looking in that direction, but also what do they know and understand about the game. And I had this really interesting conversation on this podcast with Todd Bean about Spanish soccer. And Len, I know you've been involved with, did a bit years ago with Spanish soccer and got to see close hand their perceptual cognitive abilities. And if you're a Spaniard now, a young Spanish soccer player, you grow up and you have a narrative around soccer relating to space, movement, timing of runs, how to handle space. Historically in England, and it's starting to change, but historically in England, it's been more around the physical side of things as the narrative. And I think if we take the search piece, for me it starts, I don't know what you guys think, but it starts with game understanding. What does the game mean to me? What do I have to look at? And then it's what do I look at? And how do I use what I look at?
Well, yes, it's so true. And that's why as coaches and as parents working with their own children is to do what David Hemry, one of my other great students who's back in the UK now, but wrote this wonderful book on working with kids, asking questions. And that's how, so if you're asking questions, like, why did you just do this? Or have you thought about it? Rather than just kind of mindlessly executing something, but ask questions. It's hard to ask good questions, but it's easy to really ask questions, and that's how we engage the mind in thinking about what they're doing. It's not a mindless activity. I think that's the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, and what's interesting is looking at the vision, at the research we looked at. Often there's a thought that, and it seems intuitive, that the best players, the players in the EPL, et cetera, that they have superior hardware, if you will, the superior vision, superior perception capabilities that they're born with. And interesting research that we found, a couple guys who've done tons of research in this area, Paul Ward and Mark Williams, and they looked specifically at that, whether elite athletes have this extra advantage. And so they took them out of their sports context and tested a set of EPL players, a set of college-age experienced players, and then some non-athletes. And they put them through common vision tests, unrelated to soccer. And they found that, yes, indeed, the college players and the EPL players seemed to have a little bit better visual hardware, if you will, but there was no difference at all between the elite players and the average players. And so they really kind of took that out of the equation to say, no, it's not necessarily, I'll read you the quote from Paul and Mark in their report. The notion that skilled performers are endowed with enhanced visual systems has intuitive appeal. For years, anecdotes of the best players possessing great vision have pervaded in the locker rooms, etc. The empirical evidence, however, is at best inconclusive. And they just found that, within a sports context, like you were saying, Dan, it's seeing all of those different opportunities. It's seeing all of the different scenarios and building this database in the brain about different patterns and pattern recognition. I've seen this before. It may not be specific, but over time they build this library of patterns that they can compare to their current one. And we don't understand how the brain does it, but we understand that that's why experienced players seem to make better decisions, is because they compare what they see out there, what the opportunities are, and their subconscious processes that better than an inexperienced player or a younger player.
Dan, I wanted to, and perhaps at this time, be worth mentioning too the wonderful research that's going on in the last few years on measuring what people are looking at using eye tracking devices. And there's some really good technology out there where we can now kind of get at that question you're saying, what are they really looking at? What are they attending to? And of course that informs the decision making. So now we've got the technology to measure eye tracking and see where the athlete is really looking, and it may not be the right place to look. But that's where, as coaches, we can kind of step in, and sports psychologists can step in and say, that probably isn't the best place to be looking for these cues that you want to help you make the right decisions and then execute flawlessly.
Absolutely, and on that decision piece, so we've searched, we've looked, the information has hit our retina, and within that split second we've got to make a decision. And I love what you talk about in that chapter about firefighters and how they sense the best options. They through their experience, so they track a lot of different options, and they'll just sense which one is the best one, whether it's from their subconscious. And I just think that's a fascinating landscape, and it reminds me of Lionel Messi saying that he likes to feel his way in a game. He's looking around, he's sensing it, he's feeling it, and he's making decisions throughout the game and reassessing strategies based on what he senses.
No, that's remarkable. Very, of course, such a talent. You just wonder how they're able to kind of put that into their memory systems and then recall it so quickly. And that's kind of getting the feel for the game. Yeah, they're extraordinary at being able to do this.
And, it's interesting, too, that it's another example of looking at research outside the field of sports. In that chapter, we talk about the research of Dr. Gary Klein, who's done a little bit of work in sports, but not much. And we interviewed him, and he said he'd like to do more in sports, but he was the one, he's alongside Kahneman. He kind of complemented what Kahneman and Tversky did. And he introduced this decision-making framework called recognition prime decision-making or naturalistic decision-making. And he went about it, interestingly, he said, and there's some others, researchers have done this, that when you study athletes in a lab setting, it controls the variables, you can get things accomplished there, but it doesn't replicate the chaos that's in a live game with all the emotions, etc. So when he started 30 years ago to study decision-making by people under pressure situations, like you said, he started with firefighters, and he would interview firefighters, captains, etc., immediately after they came back from a fire and talk about the decisions that were required, etc. And he tells some great stories about, first time he started doing this, he sat down with a 30-year fire captain, and they'd just come back from a large blaze. And he would say, well, what decision did you make? And the guy was like, I didn't really make any decisions. I just did what I had to do. And he tried to peel it apart a little more and more, and this guy just wasn't going to budge. And finally he got him to admit that, well, you are actually making decisions, sir. It's just that you don't recognize it. It's just all built into your tacit knowledge, into your subconscious. So, for example, whether to go into a room or not, whether to put your guys in danger or not, those are all things he's learned over the years and recognizing situations. And there's some great examples of, fire chiefs pulling their men out right, seconds before the floor collapses or something. And they ask him, well, how did you sense the floor was going to collapse? He goes, I didn't. I just felt something was wrong. And I pulled him out just in time. And so transferring that to sports, Dr. Klein told us, yes, there's very similar situations when you're making decisions in a very tight time constraint window. You have a half a second or a second on the ball to make your next decision, and the stakes are high. It's a competitive game. The emotions, the adrenaline is flowing, and it's important. You're making an important decision under time constraint, and that's where you try to build this tacit knowledge library so that you can react in time with a good decision rather than have to stop and think about it.
I love the term that you introduce within that section of your narrative, section of the chapter, a term called satisficing, which is a mashup between satisfy and suffice, and it's from the research that the best option available is the one that passes some kind of acceptable threshold.
Yeah, and researcher, I believe his name is Joseph Johnson, also out of, actually I think he's at Miami of Ohio now. But he did take Klein's research on that, and satisficing is one of Klein's terms, and he did apply it to sports, and he did verify, if you will, that most of the time the most effective decision is one that is, as he called it, take the first option.
Yeah.
And an experienced player, typically their best option is the first one that comes to their head. Pardon me. It's kind of like when you take a test and they always tell you, first answer that comes to your head, you should go with that. Because that's your subconscious brain telling you, this is the answer, dummy, you should listen to me. So,
absolutely. And that take the first option moves us neatly onto the execution phase. And a gentleman you refer to a lot in that execution chapter is a skill acquisition academic and coach called Damien Farrow, who's an Australian working, I believe, with the Australian Institute of Sport and various other organisations. And I've worked with loads of Aussies within our industry here in the UK who are full of praise for Damien's work. So could you tell us a little bit about skill execution? So we've searched, we've decided, we're taking that first option. So we perceive something, we've taken the first option. Now we've got to execute. So what do we know about effective skill execution following that quick decision?
Well, being in the world of soccer, you probably have witnessed, many penalty kicks, and most of the time they execute them with perfection, make really good decisions. But there's the odd time you see somebody, you wonder what in the world happened. They're over the top of the goal by about 3 meters. Yeah. Like, how can that happen? And these are professional players, but it does happen. So, and we talk about that towards the end of the book too, and the kinds of things that interfere with that precise, incredible execution. It does happen rarely, but it does happen. So the point here is to make sure that you have practiced and rehearsed that intentional practice under pressure situations. So this becomes that automatic behavior. It comes naturally. You really can't mess up, and you can't be thinking about your body position and where you're going to go. Many things going through your mind at one time. No, this is all kind of, you've rehearsed this. You've been there many a time before, and now I've just got to execute. So that's the goal here, to minimize the amount of interference, that self-talk that's going through your mind that's going to mess you up. So it's kind of, keeping that slate blank and then boom, execute the way you've trained. You want to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, and Damien was just a great guy to talk to. He's worked with a lot of different sports down in Australia, especially Australian rules football. And one of the quotes that I like that he added when we were talking to him is he talks about the difference between a structured skill practice and relating that to a real game situation. And his quote is, "Skill is really technique under pressure. When we're looking at methods to train skill, are we preparing our athletes to hold their technique under pressure? If we're not, we're really not meeting the needs of athletes." And so, like you said, it's a combination of learning the skill in a nice, calm setting, but now putting that into a pressurized game situation and see if they can hold that skill. And also, like we said, this whole athlete cognition is a loop, and everything depends on each other. And he was telling us about how when you make a decision, the decision is actually subconsciously made based on your assessment of your own skill. So if you see a player open 30 yards away and say, I'm going to pass him the ball, you also make an assessment of, do I have that pass in my tool bag? Am I able to put a pinpoint pass over there? Or am I going to do I not have confidence in my ability to do that? And if I do it, it'll get intercepted, they'll go down the field. Or, yes, I have that, and I'm confident I have that skill, and I understand my skill, and I can put it on that guy's 30 yards away. And so it's understanding how your understanding of your skill inventory affects your decision-making. Damien came up with he modified a very common learning technique, and he has a framework called SPORT, which I know he was happy that it came up with that acronym. But he talks about skill training in terms of specificity, progression, overload, reversibility, and tedium. And I won't go into details of each of those, but that's in that skill chapter about this is how we should teach skills and make sure our practices and our drills touch on each of those progressions, if you will, through learning.
You mentioned Damien. Yeah, I'm going to be seeing Damien next in January in Melbourne. What a great individual! Does some wonderful work, and I'd like to perhaps use this time also to acknowledge his mentor and a good friend of mine, Bruce Abernethy, who's at Queensland, but has had decades of research in skill acquisition, and he influenced people like Damien so much. And I just want to acknowledge the great contributions that Bruce Abernethy gave to us in our better understanding of kind of the psychology of skill acquisition and decision making, for that matter.
Wow, absolutely, Len, and I know it firsthand how incredible the sports over the last 30 years, the sports science and sports psychology that's come out of universities in Australia, that's come out of the Australian Institute of Sport. I know for a fact, having lived it for the last 20 years, that we in Great Britain probably wouldn't have finished, I think it was fourth and third or third and second in the last few Olympic Games.
Sure.
Without the influence and the friendly competitive nature of the Aussies, because...
Exactly, you're right, spot on, yeah.
What they did in the 80s with their sports science and the outcomes as a consequence of that really pushed us in Great Britain, where we have actually a slight advantage from a proximity perspective. Our country is small. I can drive 2 hours up the road and literally be within half an hour of 6 or 7 of the most world-famous soccer clubs, world-famous sports science, sports psychology, sporting academic departments, as you'd both know. So we have an interesting scenario here in Great Britain whereby everything's on our doorstep, and that, I think we've used that to our great advantage and prospered, but it's certainly the influence of Australia and Australian sport and Australian academic sport that's made a major impact. Now, search, decide, and execute. What I love with what you've done with this book is you've gone in two directions here in terms of what influences our capacity to search, decide, and execute. The second one is obviously my passion, which is the specific mental skills, the mental capacity to be able to do the search, decide, and execute, as you've alluded to already, Len, under pressure, in the right sort of zone of functioning, if you like. But also what I love that you've included is the physical the physical fatigue are contributing to the neural fatigue. And if I just read a few sentences here that I've taken from the book, it's not just the physical toll of a 90-minute soccer game that contributes to fatigue. Constant focus shift, tactical tweaks, and thousands of micro decisions spike the cognitive load of players. So there's a real cognitive, as you're describing there's a real cognitive load on players, and there's enormous physical demands. And I love the chapter where you talk about Diego Simeone, the Argentinian manager who managed Atletico Madrid, and his extraordinary fitness regimes with Professor Ortega, I think, his fitness coach, or Senor Ortega, who's known as the Professor, and how they at Atletico Madrid tried to compete with Barcelona and Real Madrid. And to do so, they really physically worked their players hard to make sure their brain had the capacity to search, decide, and execute.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to as the game wears on, not only physically do you get tired, but mentally you get fatigued. And that whole athlete cognition cycle slows down in some cases. And there's been plenty of research. We worked with, in fact, my friend Alex Hutchinson wrote a whole book about it called Endure.
Yes.
About the effect of fatigue. Yeah. And we as well worked with, talked to several or looked at a lot of the research on fatigue, and I'm not recalling his name right now.
Samuele Macora.
Macora, yeah.
Macora, yes, Macora. Yeah.
He's down at the University of Kent here in England.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Talking about how is there or is there not this kind of thermostat in the brain that, athletes can learn to go past the thermostat, that the brain is wired to preserve you from becoming exhausted. So it tells you to shut down a little bit sooner than you can. But he's also done a lot of work in football, in other sports, trying to understand if we mentally fatigue players and athletes during training, that we can train this fatigue factor so that they can perform better during games. So in other words, give them these cognitive tests, etc. He worked a lot with the Stroop test, etc., while they're running on a treadmill at full speed. And that if we can train the brain to stay mentally alert during these times of fatigue, then that will pay dividends late in games.
Massively. And I always recount the story of Paula Radcliffe, the English marathon runner who smashed the marathon world record by about 5 minutes in 2003. And she talks about dealing with the pain in the latter part of the race and doing so by placing her attention elsewhere, or substituting that the attention on pain towards the attention on, I think she counted in her mind, she counted her steps. So I think there's some evidence, certainly some experiential evidence there, whereby if in that acute performance moment where pain is searing through your body and you have the capacity, or you've built the capacity to direct your focus of attention and distract it away from the pain, then it can help your performance. I mean, that's not so much search, decide and execute, but it can certainly help your performance.
Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm.
And then we move on to the final piece here, which is that you label it as commitment, the mental piece, if you like, and I know you refer to grit and you refer to mindset from Carol Dweck and motivation. So do you think you could explain these concepts a little bit? Where do these come into the search, decide and execute piece?
Well, I guess I'll start with this, and then Dan can follow up. Certainly, those search, decide, and execute are the principal components and the features of the book as we constructed it. But we realized that there are other components that help drive this too, and it's kind of more of the affective domain rather than the cognitive domain. And as Dan said earlier, they're intricately related, to be sure. But we felt it would be important to also talk about some of these concepts that we've kind of touched on in the search, decide, and execute, like choking under pressure, for example. Like how does that happen? So we pulled in some of the experts to talk about the great research that they've done in that area. And I've always been impressed with Carol Dweck's growth mindset, and I've used it in my practical and clinical work as well, kind of to really promote very much the notion of growing your mindset and believing you can continuously strive to get better at what you're doing. So we felt it would be important that we kind of talk about the state of the research in that area. And then the other one is, as you mentioned, was the grit, or what many people in sport refer to as mental toughness. Lots of good work we've done in Australia and in the UK, also in that area too, on mental toughness. And then one of my grad students, as I was leaving the academic world, did a wonderful dissertation on developing this whole notion of mental toughness. And it's a huge part of becoming a playmaker in any sport, that you've got to have that growth mindset constantly. You've got to have this mental toughness, or what we call grit, and otherwise you don't become a playmaker. Dan, you may want to elaborate on that a bit too.
Yeah, and I think we tried to pull the three together in that last one, talking about because it's kind of like Dan, you alluded to the 10,000 hour conversation that's kind of gotten out of control. But it's also, while the research that Carol Dweck did on mindset, as well as the grit research from Angela Duckworth, to me, it's the same kind of phenomenon that happened with Anders Ericsson in 10,000 Hours. Each of those academics had very good research, and they did their studies, and they had findings, and they published their findings. It's when it got released out into the wild, all of these concepts kind of take on their own life, and all of a sudden, you've got parents with stopwatches counting, or calendars counting the 10,000 hours until their son or daughter becomes world class. And Anders would tell us, when we talked to him, well, okay, that kind of got taken out of context. I never was focusing on just that specific number. I was focusing on deliberate practice. That's the point that I would like to drive home. Yep. Is it's how you practice, not so much how much you practice. And the same I think happened with grit and with mindset. Is they're very good concepts, and there's research studies. Professor Duckworth will say even today, we're still studying mindset and grit. We don't have all the answers. We have some early indications of what it is, but again, people at school districts, et cetera, have jumped on this and said, we have to teach mindset everywhere. We have to teach kids grit and all of this. So it's still, the core research is there and good, and I think athletes can learn a lot from it. It just has to be taken within the context of what the research said at this point. Dan, what have you found as you've talked about those concepts? I'm interested to hear your perspective of at the highest levels, at EPL, et cetera. Are those concepts misunderstood, do you think, or what's been your experience?
Yes, I think they are, and I think it's. I'm going to really put my psychologist cap on here, and I'm going to say I just think it's so human of us to go to the extreme ends of the interpretation. Sure, the 10,000 hours, the grit, the mindset is it can be so polarizing, and when it's polarized, we go to the extreme ends rather than populating the middle ground and understanding that if you take mindset, and I'm pretty sure Professor Dweck would agree, and I think she's on record as saying, is that it's important to have a growth mindset. Occasionally, you might have to have a fixed mindset about certain subject matters. I think I've worked with coaches and with players who have been so obsessed with growth that they've hijacked their working memory. And they've got lost in amongst all the aggregation of marginal gains and all the 1%. And in the end, they can't move. They can't move for growth. They're reading all the books, and it's like, whoa, hang on. What's the strategy here? Let's bring this back to center ground. And what's the strategy? I think when it comes to grit, no doubt, grit, resilience is vitally important at at certain times. I think there's an interesting landscape here with confusing it with high conscientiousness. I think from a personality perspective with the big five, I think grit is possibly high conscientiousness. And I think that clearly there's a time when we don't want to be gritty, when actually I think that having a culture that admits vulnerability or allows athletes to express vulnerability. And let me be clear, Angela Duckworth, I'm at 99.9% sure, and you can tell me, would agree with this, is that being gritty all the time is maladaptive. Having a culture where an athlete is able to talk about their vulnerabilities and actually just stop, sit down and say, whoa, enough, actually I'm feeling this here. So I think I think mental flexibility, nimbleness ultimately is important, understanding that when these concepts come out, no academic is saying this is the way it is, because no academic can say that, can they, Len? It's
absolutely. Yeah.
These are my hypotheses, these are what I'm testing, there is evidence supporting this, but we live in an uncontrolled environment. There are always going to be times when you shouldn't do this, or there's environments we should experience where this doesn't have to be the case.
You're so right, Dan, about kind of taking extreme positions on something and feeling that this is the answer to everything. And I see that happening now, and I'm sure you're experiencing also in the UK, because we were getting a blast of it here in North America about the whole issue of mental health as part of the field that we're working in, and with athlete depression and other forms of maladaptive behavior. So now I'm kind of looking at it as an outsider in some cases. It's that there's folks searching for mental health issues under every pitch. You know, and it's the point you were making is that we just it's kind of human nature to take extreme positions on it, and it's getting that nice cognitive balance that we should be striving for.
What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. And I that was our intent with that chapter, was to just bring these concepts up, and we addressed the 10,000 hours earlier in the book of this is all good research by good researchers, but let's not take it out of context, as you said, Dan. Let's read what's really there and not get too carried away with it. They're all important concepts, and I think they all have something to add. But I think some of the research takes on kind of this celebrity status through no fault of the professors. They don't seek this out. It's just that parents, coaches, etc. We want to hang our hat on something, and so we run with something and think it makes sense. Well, interestingly, on also the last chapter of the book, and maybe you'll get to this, Dan, we talked about kind of the more specific research on the concept of choking and the concept of clutch performances, which kind of leads to some of this. We talked with Dr. Rob Gray at Arizona State.
Yep.
He did some wonderful research a few years ago with Dr. Sion Bilak, who's now at president of Barnard College. And they looked at the concept of choking and why athletes choke. And choke they defined as performing significantly below expectations. And they came up with, there were several, or actually two working theories, a distraction theory, and then what they found with golfers, and I'm sure, Dan, you're familiar with this research, they looked at putting, they looked at golf in general, and they found more a theory that they called the explicit monitoring theory was the cause of choking, in that the goal with skill training is that you get to this point of automaticity, and that's really what the deliberate practice is about, is that, as we talked about, you can get this tacit knowledge where you don't have to think about the skills you're performing. They just happen automatically. But however, when the pressure is on and something doesn't go right, and you start thinking about the individual components of an athletic move, that's when things break down. If you think about how you're tying your shoes, you might get a little confused. Or if you think about how you tie your tie, you may lose the flow of that. And it's the same way with shooting a free throw, throwing a pass, kicking a ball, etc., when you start breaking it down and thinking about it, that's what their research showed with athletes that would happen. And so that's, again, part of the training goal is to get to that automaticity even when the pressure's on, that it doesn't break down like that.
If I may, I think it's a fascinating landscape what you've just said there, because and I can assure you, I certainly know what choking feels like on a golf course. Dan. I know a little bit about the research, but I certainly have experienced the choking sensation, and I think it is fascinating because I find, and I want to bring Len in here because he's as experienced a practitioner as anybody on the planet, if not more than anybody on the planet. And I agree with you, Dan, and I understand what the research is saying. At the same time, let's take a sport like golf. I understand that I have to automate or automatize a degree of my motor skills. I also have to appreciate that I'm playing over 150 acres of land where no two shots look the same, where no two shots really are the same, where I might have a variety of lies and a variety of shot demands. And so to simply say I can practice until I don't have to think about my golf swing is kind of I just don't know how it adds up. I surely have to have some swing keys and some triggers and some cues to be able to execute my swing motion in different scenarios. And I find that if I go back to being a competitor, and again, I completely agree with the research, if I overthink my golf swing, if I'm standing on the tee and I'm looking down the fairway and I'm over the golf ball and I start to doubt my swing and I have 3 or 4 things to think about, I'm dead. That ball is going in the trees, I can assure you of that. So bang on with the research, and I understand that relates to choking. At the same time, for me to occupy my attention, I believe I need a task. I need to feel a movement on my backswing. I need something, that second and a half to swing, I need to focus my attention on something. So that attention and choking, I think, is an interesting landscape in golf.
No, I think you bring in I'm glad we're talking about golf too, because I've done quite a bit of research in that area too, and worked with a number of golfers. And one of the great golfers of all time, who many of the pros would say was the greatest ball striker of all time, a Canadian by the name of Mo Norman.
Oh yes,
and maybe you've heard. And he was a rather unique individual. And when he walked up to a ball, they asked him, "So why is it you don't take any time, Mo? You just get up there and you strike it." Now, you gave an example of where no two are identical, and that's true. But he said, while I'm walking to the ball, I got all the time in the world to think about what I'm going to be doing. So I do that thinking, and I get up to the ball, and why should I stand over the ball? It was a great concept. I just hit it. And he was apparently the greatest ball. I saw him at the end of it when he was in the 70s striking balls. Absolutely amazing. But that was his answer. Like, I've got all this time as I'm walking to the ball to think about what I'm going to do. And I rehearse it, and I go up there and then strike the ball. But I'm glad you brought up this notion of golf, because it's a rather interesting sport. And we stayed away primarily from the individual sports, but much of this is the same. And it's kind of, when do you think and how little do you think? And I think what you learned over the years, and probably you would be a lot more effective golfer today if you kind of knew then what you know now. And it's kind of, you have to focus on some keys to execute the shot.
Yep.
But you want to still rely on the automaticity and not be breaking down the skill, because for sure it's in the water, it's in the trees.
Absolutely. I know about that. Dan?
No, I think your firsthand knowledge is perfect for it, because you're right that, and that's what we've talked about before. Research in a lab is much different than a real-world experience.
Yeah.
And I think what Dr. Gray and others were saying is basically these skills, while your golf swing has been learned and internalized and chunked in your working memory as far as how your swing feels and what you do about it. But yes, at a higher level, you are preparing for a specific shot in a specific area. And so there are some things you do have to monitor. I think their points was when things aren't going well, and in thinking even outside of golf, someone shooting a free throw or something, and then some kind person tells them, well, bend your knees some more, keep your elbow up. And then the player starts thinking about those individual components. They de-chunk that entire motor skill. Then that starts to screw things up and starts to change things quickly.
I think absolutely. It's really interesting to have you both on the line with this, because I think that this is... I agree with all of that. I think that the challenge I've found in sports psychology is when we speak about that choking notion and automaticity, and even when we bring in something like the zone and Mihaly, if I can get that name right.
I never can.
Thank you, Len. So I choked on that name, by the way. There, I completely went.
It's a complex skill.
It is.
Can't automate that. It's like Zaichkowsky.
Yeah. And I think sometimes for me in my practice, I find that people will say to me, well, I just like to go out on a pitch and think of nothing. And I'm like, okay, but I do think sometimes thinking of nothing, this notion of thinking of nothing, as alluring as it sounds, can invite thought in. And that's where I suppose I've, in my work, and I'm going to bring in a bit of Dan Abraham's colloquialism here, I've come up with something called a game face, for instance, which might be a couple of key triggers that are related around action-based words, like from a basic put, sharp and upbeat. I want to be sharp and upbeat, and those they evoke emotion and they evoke actions on the pitch, and how do I want to defend here? How do I want to win the header? How do I want to challenge the striker? Sharp and alert, sharp and alert, sharp and alert. That's who I want to be. Mm-hmm. And a player going out onto the pitch or the ice rink or wherever it is, the baseball pitch, whatever, with having just a couple of keys that can focus their attention. And my concern, I think sometimes people read the sports psychology literature and they think, oh, well, all I've got to do is quiet my mind. All I've got to do is and I do that by clearing my mind. And it's like, well, to turn down the volume of thought, to clear the mind, actually having a few key phrases or a few key triggers is a really effective way of doing that. It's not just thinking nothing, it's just having a few key things to say to yourself at the right time.
I agree with you 100%. You're spot on with that. Yeah, it's you can't have that total blank slate. You've got to have some key indicators that you focus on, sustained focus that'll enable you to execute every time. Absolutely. Gentlemen, it has been absolutely fantastic, and as I alluded to earlier, your book is my Bible right now when I talk to coaches certainly on the search and decide and execute side of things. It's just brilliant. Well, where can people find you? Where can people buy the book? How can they get in contact if they've got any questions? Well, Dan, I think go ahead, Dan. You can give us that intro too. And I just want to say that I know paperbacks are going to be coming out in Australia in January, and that's why I'm going over there to help promote it. They're changing the cover a little bit, put a cricket ball on an Aussie rules football. Fair enough. And we're going to use a quote from the Sydney Swans head coach on the cover rather than the hockey coach. And so we're going to Australiafy it a little bit. And Dan, you may want to expand upon what's happening in the UK right now and other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that, Dan. So the book officially went on sale on June 12th, but I understand that it actually went on sale in the UK and Australia and other places on August 9th. So it's available now, Amazon UK, just about all of the Amazons around the world. There is a hardcover, an ebook version, and an audio version available now. And as Len mentioned, on January 29th of next year, there will be a paperback version coming out. So it's all available now if you want to go get it. As far as contacting Len or I, our website is 80percentmental.com, 80, and the words percent mental. Dan, I'm sure you'll put that in your show notes. And then there's contact information there. What Len and I do on the consulting side is we've partnered with a couple different technologies to work with teams and coaches. We don't work so much with individual athletes, but with teams and coaches, we have a couple assessment tools that we're working with. We're also busy researching for a next book, which we believe will be focused just on decision-making. And so we're happy to talk to teams and coaches about, specifically how they teach decision-making and just kind of diving deep into that area as well. So really appreciate your time, Dan, and thank you for letting us be on the podcast.
No, well, guys, it's been an honour and a delight, and I'm really looking forward to that decision-making book because about 6 months ago, one of the world's leading coaches, clearly I won't mention who it is, said to me, nobody knows how to improve decision-making. So I will look forward to...
slowly but surely we'll get there. It's like, what did we know about strength and conditioning 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Yeah, good.
Exactly. Guys, thank you so much. Now, everybody, if you enjoyed that as much as I did, please do leave a rating and a review, and don't forget to subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to be updated about future episodes. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.